Good day to you. I'm here to present a refined approach to the evaluation of the potential effects of pesticide registrations on listed species by looking at a case study with Methomyl and the federally listed species, the Dakota skipper. In March of 2020, the U.S. EPA issued a revised method for listed species biological evaluations of conventional pesticides and applied that revised guidance to the draft BE for Methomyl and carbaryl. As part of an in-depth assessment and selected case studies, Corteva and its consultant team tested the revised method and applied additional refinements to the overall risk assessment process. Then, granular examinations of selected species were conducted to demonstrate improvements to the FIFRA risk assessment process and inform subsequent ESA consultations by providing multiple lines of evidence by which EPA can then assess the potential for individual level effects, and the services can judge the likelihood of population level jeopardy should those species pass on to them in consultation. The case study here on the Dakota skipper is examined further from the perspective of its meaning in the overall FIFRA ESA process. The interim method and the agency's efforts to integrate the FIFRA risk assessment process and the ESA jeopardy determination process has been and still is a challenge. The first interim approach or method was released by the agencies in November of 2013. Since that time, the initial or revised process has been applied by EPA to 5 BEs on 3 organophosphate and 2 carbamate insecticides. All 5 products are legacy compounds, long on the market with mature labels, meaning that all uses and use sites are likely now to be on the end-use labeling. Risk assessments, public comments, reports, and presentations like this one most likely have generated millions of pages of research, commentary, or criticism. In this process, there are many accomplishments, but at this point, the biggest need, stated simply, is how can we deliver an evaluation that readily advises the services of whether or not the predicted risk is measurable, observable, or likely to occur when the EPA process is based on a national level outcome of predicting the effects to an individual, and the services ESA consultation evaluation must make a population level call in the jeopardy determination process. Case studies such as this one on the Dakota skipper reveal that practical review at the national level must find a balance between the typical ESA site-based evaluation and the comprehensive FIFRA national level risk assessment to not only focus on refining the probability of risk, but also to answer the question of that risk's likelihood of being measurable, observable, or even likely to occur. We use Methomyl and the listed terrestrial invertebrate Dakota skipper here in the spirit of the definition of a case study. That is, case studies are based on an in-depth investigation of a single individual and are analyses of policies, institutions, or other systems that are studied holistically by one or more methods. In other words, holistically, in what direction does all of the effort expended since 2013 point? One may wonder why we selected the Dakota skipper. It is a challenging species due to the limited amount of data that is available for it and that lend to robust risk assessment. Additionally, the skipper has unique behaviors that impact standard risk assessment assumptions. To counter these things, however, there is toxicity data available on closely related species so that the lack of data on the skipper of interest can be somewhat offset. And finally, the conclusions about Methomyl risk to the skipper are impacted greatly by how the risk assessment moves forward and where refinements stop, thus illustrating how refinements and methods of risk evaluation impact the outcome of multiple approaches. At the time of this presentation, not all results are in, since EPA has not released the final BE and the services have not yet released their biological opinion on Methomyl. However, we can review how the skipper has moved through the draft BE and the subsequent Registron-applied refined risk assessment. The 3 steps of the BE, as currently conducted per the revised interim method, are first, Step 1, identify which species and designated critical habitats are expected to be affected by the assessed pesticide at the individual level, warranting a may affect determination, and which species would not be affected by the pesticide, warranting a no effect determination. The Dakota skipper fell into the may affect category. Then step 2, determine whether use of the assessed pesticide is either not likely to adversely affect or likely to adversely affect a single individual of a listed species or designated critical habitat. An NLAA determination can be made if the assessment finds that the effects of a pesticide on an individual of a listed species is insignificant, discountable, or completely beneficial, not language that we have in FIFRA. The Dakota skipper initially fell into the likely to adversely affect category given the resolution of data examined and the limitations on the knowledge available to describe and apply the unique characteristics of the organism to the collection of circumstances contributing to its potential exposure and thus risk. You might not see a step 3 here because step 3 is where the services begin their determination of jeopardy. By revising the order of steps and moving to successive steps for refinements not used in the EPA approach to date, Corteva was able to screen out additional species as potentially being of concern and also apply local species or site-specific data to the assessment process. This in turn lessened the number of species that needed to, perhaps unnecessarily, move through to the service's formal consultation. So how did the skipper fare through this revised process? As the agencies worked diligently in applying their revised interim method to Methomyl, the registrant, Corteva Agriscience, also delved into the listed species assessment, testing the interim method and adding refinements to it. Using a consultant team to construct and apply a national assessment, the resulting structure of the assessment follows and implements a different order of steps and additional refinements. For example, as part of the problem formulation, Corteva removed certain wide-ranging remote-from-use species. Also, standard EPA screening tools and models were first applied without spatial specificity to determine what taxa were exceeding levels of concern, that is, were potentially at risk. The Dakota skipper is a terrestrial invertebrate, that is, an insect, so its levels of concerns were exceeded at this point. The next step that was added was to compare species ranges to the use pattern footprints and crop groups to determine if there was a 1% overlap, and the interim method, therefore, their standard is exceeded. There was more than a 1% overlap for general county level species use site comparisons, so the levels of concern were exceeded and an assumed may effect was gathered at this point. On a species-specific basis, spatial data explicit for each use pattern was combined with a factor for percent cropped area to determine if the 1% overlap interim method standard was exceeded. There was more than 1% overlap for some species in the use site comparisons, so at this point levels of concern for selected species were there for selected use sites. On a site-specific basis, use data was then added to derive a percent crop treated prediction within each use pattern's percent crop acreage. There was a great reduction in species having more than a 1% overlap, and at this point levels of concern for the skipper were not exceeded. Given these two different sets of results, EPA's and the registrants, in this process, what's next? Step 3, according to the revised interim process, is now a services task and no longer an EPA task. How does the Dakota skipper fare then when information is transferred from EPA to the services by way of the consultation package? And what if the registrant provides additional factual information? Some unknowns entering into the speech services part of the consultation process include their time available to look in detail at the EPA BE and evaluate where it would benefit from additional species-specific expertise, and how or if additional fact-finding by the registrant is useful to them. It is also questionable as to whether or not the service's resources will allow regional or species-specific experts within the agency to dedicate time to the examination of species traits when compared to local conditions of exposure, taking into account a thorough understanding of the agronomic crop production methods, product labeling, toxicity, and existing mitigations, conservation strategies, and regional best management practices. All of these things contribute to whether or not risk or even exposure actually occurs. The factual status of the Dakota skipper in the May effect process may change if a detailed species-specific examination can impact the individual level results and ultimately the BO by not only defining whether there is jeopardy, but possibly preempting the need to make a jeopardy determination if in fact the species is not exposed to risk, not likely to be affected by product use, or risk is adequately minimized by existing best management and conservation strategies. What do we need to learn when we focus on the species? Details of the information gathered and outcome of the refined risk assessment calculations were presented by Stafford et al. At the ACS Agro meeting in August. Dakota skippers were screened out then in that study, and the one we're talking about today, as not being of concern by applying additional refinements in the data and in the risk assessment methods. Mitigating circumstances fall into three broad areas: species ecology, behavior, and status. The skipper is unlikely to be near agricultural areas, is not active during Methomyl use periods, and occupies prairie habitat, which, in the sampling done to date, shows no carbamate pesticide residue. Thus, they are not exposed. Risk refinement using additional site and species-specific data provided refined drift estimates and proximity distances and toxicity thresholds from more closely related species, and this greatly reduced the action area or even eliminated the initial overlap assumption. Thus, the species is not at risk. And finally, conservation measures already working in favor of the species were considered. The skipper does not use disturbed or even restored prairie habitat. A focus on protection of the areas that it does inhabit, on programs to increase its populations there and build habitat connectivity would seem paramount. In other words, habitat enhancement will contribute to species recovery. Mitigations for crop protection on labels will not. Returning to where does this point us? While we learned from the Dakota skipper case study and other companion case studies undertaken by the registrant, closer examination results in greatly reduced or no presumption of risk if the 1,114 species identified to the services by EPA as likely or perhaps affected were subject to this depth of research of analysis. The resource demand, however, would be about 1 year's time of one expert at each of the 80 field offices that the services has. And it's very unlikely that these resources can be mustered by the agencies, or conversely, the consultation process stretched out over even more years to accommodate such work with existing resources. Consequently, we need to work to answer these important and so far unanswered questions. How can the agencies incorporate important efforts that the registrant is willing to make to better inform the FIFRA ESA consultation process? What efficiencies and enhancements can be adopted to expedite assessment through information now in or added to the FESTF Gopher Information Management System? Which of the registrant risk assessment steps, including additional tools and refinement approaches, can be added to EPA's toolkit to not only bring efficiency but also additional improvements to the revised methods? What step can be added to include the impact of existing conservation initiatives on recovery or to show exposure is not precluding recovery of a species identified as concerned? And how might species be prioritized so that detailed evaluation of a taxonomically or ecologically related group can be represented by in-depth evaluation of one or a limited set of its selected members, or to focus on efforts that are related to those of highest conservation priority. In conclusion, in our goal of species protection and the provision to users of the pesticide tools they need, their parallel goals, trusting the time-tested FIFRA assessment process as described in the 2004 overview document, which, as noted by the agencies in the revised method, is still in use in certain settings, maximizing resources by better involving the registrant in data provision and assessment, which would parallel other types of consultations in a non-FIFRA setting, and ensuring existing conservation initiatives are considered and supported so that their long-term success is ensured. Thank you.